My name is Paul Webster. I'm the director of Hope Street Coalition. Hope Street Coalition is an effort of citizens, elected officials, policymakers, organizations who are advocating for public policy changes at the intersection of homelessness, mental illness, and addiction.
Thank you for that. So some people would say today in California, we're facing the homelessness crisis. So would you give maybe top 3 reasons why we're in this situation right now?
Sure. Yeah, the top 3 reasons that California has a homelessness crisis is, first, it's federal and state policies that are focused on the creation of permanent supportive housing as the primary means to reduce the number of people living on the streets. And what I mean by that is, by focusing on housing as the primary means to get people off the street, what you're assuming is that providing housing and services actually works to reduce the number of people living on the streets. And if you look at the data in terms of the number of units created, the amount of funding that's been made available to create permanent supportive housing, and at the same time, the increase in unsheltered homelessness, it's not causal, it's more correlative, but it demonstrates that by focusing and doubling down on this assumption that creating housing reduces the number on the streets, to me, it drives a number of questions in terms of whether or not this is an effective approach. So when the other thing that it does is that it bases this belief that homelessness is created by economic factors instead of behavioral and health factors. So when you make that initial assumption, for what I believe is that, you know, California is having a homeless crisis because they're essentially assuming that their intervention is going to directly relate to reducing people on the street, and it doesn't. The second reason that we've got a homelessness crisis in California is that, bottom line, California makes it easy to live unhoused and to consume narcotics. We have reduced the penalties for living in public spaces. The Ninth Circuit Court, through the Martin v. Boise decision, has essentially created an additional hurdle for municipalities to enforce their anti-camping zones. So because of that, you can camp wherever pretty much with impunity. And because we've taken the possession and use of heavy narcotics and made them misdemeanors, there's no disincentive really to engage in drugs, and oftentimes that drug use leads to addiction. And then also, I'd say, you know, tied into that is the fact that California has just not created enough places to go for people who need treatment, whether it's mental illness and addiction. And if I could sneak in a 4th reason that California is in a homeless crisis, it's because California has, in an attempt to reduce prison overcrowding and to advance progressive political agenda regarding incarceration and, you know, who should be in prison and who shouldn't, they've essentially just released tens of thousands of inmates into communities. So you've got all of these things working together that make it very easy and to be homeless in California. And that's why it has a homeless crisis. It's easy to be homeless in California.
Thank you for sharing that. Some people might say, well, a lot of homeless individuals in California are from California. Would you agree with that?
Sure. I mean, there are a lot of people who are unsheltered and homeless from California. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, California does act as a draw to other parts of the country that don't make it easy, or just, we all know that there's this interesting conversation about the weather. If all things being equal, would you rather be homeless in Minnesota or in Los Angeles? And everybody assumes, oh, I'd rather be homeless in Los Angeles. Well, it's hard to really control for weather. I mean, there was a paper that was written by Kevin Corinth when he was with the White House Council on Economic Advisors that does kind of control for certain weather aspects. But here's the bottom line. If you're at a place that doesn't mind necessarily that you're living in a tent in the middle of a median strip, they kind of allow you to do that. You get all kinds of supports to do that. If you're involved in drug use, which a majority of folks who are homeless are involved in drug use without any fear of arrest or prosecution, you're going to get more of it. If you make it easier, you're going to get more of it. And that's what California has done.
Thank you. I was talking with Professor Keith Humphreys just now, and he was speaking of very similar points. And then mainly, California has this very liberal culture, right? We respect people's autonomy, and it's sort of like the Wild West. And people come here to pursue themselves, to find themselves, and sometimes, just too much freedom, I guess. Yeah,
and I mean, recently somebody shared with me kind of like a social media post or something about how if you want to go on a cheap vacation, you could do it and live, on the beach in California. Some people would call that being homeless. Some people would call that having a cheap vacation for a little while. So California tolerates that. That's the point. You tolerate that. I remember one time I was vacationing in New Jersey, and coming from California, I thought all beaches were open to the public and free. And I walked onto the beach in somewhere on the shore in New Jersey, and somebody said, "Hey, where's your tag?" And I said, "What are you talking about?" And they said, "Well, to be on the beach here, you have to have a little tag that shows that you paid in order to vacation on the beach, to lay on the sand and to play in the water and do all that kind of stuff." And I was kind of offended. I was kind of like, "What are you talking about? The beach isn't free." Well, in California they are, not everywhere.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. So I would like to ask you, maybe, I guess you already sort of alluded to some of this, but could you tell us some public policies that have, definitely failed? We have evidence they have failed in reducing homelessness in California, and nevertheless, we continue to implement those policies.
Well, let me just caveat this a little bit. When you say that we actually can demonstrate that they failed, again, we're trying to tie some causality into this. Mm-hmm. See, what is your objective, right? So if your objective is to increase the supply of affordable housing, you can't necessarily say that incentivizing the creation of permanent supportive housing has necessarily failed in that objective. I think what is happening is that people, again, assume that by creating permanent supportive housing, it's going to have a negative effect on the amount of people living on the streets. And most people in California, and I think the data would suggest that as we have increased in incentivizing the creation and provision of permanent supportive housing, we've not seen a reduction in unsheltered homelessness in California. I know that there are proponents of permanent supportive housing that say it doesn't matter, all housing is good, so we've actually achieved something. Well, it's just not necessarily connected to the outcome that we're measuring it by. And I think that's, so to answer your question, I think public policies that have failed in reducing homelessness are incentivizing permanent supportive housing at the expense of transitional housing and other types of housing and treatment models, that require participation and improvement. I think that's a public policy. You know, California in 2016 adopted an assembly bill that made it the law of the state of California to require that every dollar of public funding that is intended to go for homelessness must follow the housing first approach. I think that is a public policy that has failed. I think another public policy that's failed in reducing homelessness, it wasn't its necessarily intention, it wasn't its necessary goal, but this public policy has increased the number of folks who are homeless, and that is disconnecting addiction treatment, workforce training, behavioral interventions, and mental health from housing. There used to be a time when you would accept housing because there was a acknowledged need for workforce training or addiction treatment or mental illness treatment. What started happening from the federal government on down, and California adopted this completely in 2016, was they divorced and separated, they unmoored any requirements for participation in improvement programs with the provision of housing. I think that was intended to reduce the number of folks that are experiencing homelessness, but I don't think that's been the case. And I think the last public policies, particularly here in California, is through Prop 47, through Prop 57, which was not intended specifically to reduce homelessness, but I think those statewide ballot propositions have shown to actually have been contributing to increase in homelessness through the normalization of addiction, the normalization of drug use, the normalization of crime, and essentially the normalization of public psychosis. So there have been specific policies that, you know, whether they were intended to reduce homelessness or not, have actually acted that have increased the number of people who are living out on the streets.
Thank you. So how does, you mentioned the state of California adopted this housing first approach, and it actually came from the federal government, right? So how does the federal government tie its funding for state and local governments with the housing first approach? Are all the states adopting this, or some states are checked out?
So first of all, states are not necessarily the targets of HUD funding for homelessness assistance programs. HUD decided that instead of targeting the states, they would target regions for funding opportunities for homelessness assistance grants. And so they required applicants, which are these regional collaboratives, they required these applicants to adopt a housing first approach in order to receive funding. Now, there's a very important little caveat in that statement that I just said. What HUD did is they didn't require applicants to adopt housing first in order to receive funding. What they did was they prioritized the point system of scoring applications so that it'd be really difficult to score high and not demonstrate that you've adopted a housing first approach. So it's not necessarily a requirement, but for all intents and purposes, it is a requirement to get the funding, at least to score high enough to get the higher levels of funding.
Can you define the region that you just mentioned?
Sure. So these regional, what the United States Congress did in 2009 is they codified through statute the creation of kind of informal consortiums that were beginning to be created by homelessness advocates throughout the country. And they call them the Continuums of Care. And so what originally, the original intention was that if you were on, let's say, the west side of Los Angeles and you needed a shelter bed or some housing, but they didn't have any on the west side of Los Angeles, there may be some shelter beds or some housing, let's just say downtown. So instead of this person having to, by chance or through direction, travel all the way over to downtown, they were trying to create kind of this system to say, look, if we've got beds over here and you don't have any over there, bring them over here and we'll take care of them. That was the intention, which is actually a pretty good efficiency model, if you will. But what HUD did and what the Congress did in 2009 is they created these quasi-governmental entities that are made up mostly of the people seeking funding for homelessness assistance from the federal government. And they called them Continuums of Care, and they required regions to not only create continuums of care and have specific regulations about who's in the continuum of care, who they want to make that up, but also restricted funding applications to the continuums of care. So if you were, let's just say, a city, you couldn't apply for this funding. If you were a state, you couldn't apply for this funding. Only continuums of care could apply for this funding. Now, the city could be part of the continuum of care, but it couldn't in and of itself apply for the funding just for the city for homelessness assistance.
Thank you for that. So what is the exact relationship between, I get that you said the COC, the Continuum of Care, is a quasi-governmental agency that sort of like help local homelessness within, 50-mile radius, let's say. But what is the relationship between COC and the local government? Do they have sort of like a collaborative relationship? And also, what's the relationship between COCs and the federal government? Do they have the power at the HUD to appoint someone in charge of a COC? Or if the COC didn't comply with some of the HUD's requirement, do they have the power to eliminate a person and appoint another person?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the relationship between the COC and a local government, so because the COC is a regional consortium that HUD required regions to set up to qualify for homelessness assistance, each region is a little different, but each region of the country has adopted this continuum of care model. And they work to plan and coordinate and fund local homelessness assistance projects. So imagine if there was no kind of coordinating consortium, every project in every community would send their proposals off to HUD, and HUD would have to evaluate all of these local programs and say, well, it looks good to me, let's send them some money. And that was essentially kind of the system before the continuum of care. What HUD tried to do is they tried to interject competition at the local level by saying, we're going to have all of you providers be a part of this consortium, and we're gonna tell you, here's the amount of money that's at play here, and you've got to figure out which one of the providers will get the lion's share of the money or not get the lion's, get small amounts of money based on certain performance metrics. So that's the relationship. Now, and the relationship between the municipality is they can be a part of the governing body. They can assist the continuum of care with additional funding for example, in Los Angeles, the Los Angeles Homelessness Services Administration, is called LAHSA. It not only receives funding from the federal government through the continuum of care, it receives funding from the state of California, it receives funding from the city of Los Angeles, it receives funding from the county of Los Angeles, and it was actually created through joint powers agreement between the county and the city. So in that regard, it is a quasi-governmental agency because it has authority and has the ability to use government money, but it is, and it in Los Angeles, it has appointed people to their board based on, the county and the political elected representatives, but it's mostly made up of providers who are private entities, private nonprofit entities. So one of the interesting things is there's a lot of diversity across the country in terms of how involved states get with local continuums of care. So in some places like California, the state is very involved because they are providing grant monies that are available to counties and available to continuums of care. But in other states, the state doesn't have a big homelessness problem, but they understand that there are efforts going on in probably some of their larger cities, whether or not that state wants to create funding that local agency or municipality continuum care could benefit from, that's really up to the state. In California, the continuums of care are all based in the counties. So they're really strongly connected to the counties. I think it's this idea that what's the relationship between the continuum of care and the federal government? The continuums of care are dependent they're dependent on the federal government. They're dependent on funding. They're dependent on what's called technical assistance or consultants that will assist them in meeting the goals and the objectives of the continuum of care program. They're dependent on guidance and regulation. So there are provisions in the regulation, like you said, that if they want to replace one of the providers as being like who they call the collaborative applicant, who actually makes application to HUD, they can do that. They can vote people off. They can vote people on. So there's lots of different ways that the local continuum of care really serves the federal government and is incentivized to serve the federal government because that's who's really paying. Now, and most of the continuums of care, they do get money from the counties, they do get money from the cities, they do get money from the federal government. They're supposed to leverage these dollars, but it wouldn't have happened without the federal government.
Thank you. So that means that this strong dependency of COCs on the federal government means whatever comes from the government, the COCs will go ahead and implement. For example, the Housing First movement, right? We all know that Housing First was starting to, it was originally proposed in the late 1990s, I believe. And then in 2000, there were a few papers that proposed the idea. And then the idea got more and more popular, and the HUD started to promote the Housing First approach in the early 2000s. So what is the federal goal of HUD to promote the Housing First approach?
So obviously the federal goal was to assist communities in addressing homelessness. I think it's important that how they identified to assist communities in addressing homelessness. To me, that's a much more important question than, what was, the objective is we want to help communities with homelessness.
Right.
What the federal government did was they tied the creation and provision of affordable housing for very low income individuals and families to the objective of reducing homelessness. They tied those two things together and they funded that approach. So again, it's based on this assumption that by providing housing, you will be able to reduce the number of people living in public and private spaces where they're not intended to live. Now, what's interesting about kind of how Housing First kind of really got its legs, like I said, it was this very local kind of system to increase efficiencies between various, and these things were going on. These things have been going on for a long time. They kind of formalized it. I kind of said, look, if we go to the counties, if we go to our funders as a unified collaborative, this will increase our ability to get more funds and support, more resources so that we could serve more people. That was the original intent. But I think what happened is that when communities began struggling with increased untreated and unhoused people with serious mental illness and serious addiction, I think what happened was the shelters became overwhelmed. In a lot of places, they were unable to meet the demand of living on the streets. So what the Housing First proponents did, they criticized these shelters because they had these programmatic elements. They had these high barriers, like you had to be sober, or you have to participate like a rescue mission in some kind of a religious service in order to get shelter and housing, things like that. They began to criticize that, saying that if you just gave them housing first, then they would be able to work on these things, but you're actually requiring them to make life changes before you're providing housing. I don't believe that's what these organizations were doing. What they were saying is, we're less interested in housing. We're more interested in the root causes of you not having housing. So we want to address those root causes. The housing, that's just part and parcel of it. And we're a private organization. We have rules. You have to observe these rules if you're going to be in a congregate setting, et cetera, et cetera. So critics began to criticize that. And the studies began to demonstrate that providing housing without these same conditions retained more people in housing. So I want to be very clear. The studies weren't there to show that people's lives improve. The studies were there to show that if you essentially gave housing without conditions, you would have people who would stay in housing longer. Do you see the difference?
Yeah.
Really,
actually voting like 85% of the time, I think, after several years of study, right?
Yes. So what's really interesting is that a lot of those early studies still employed conditions on housing, but the overarching narrative was that this housing was without conditions such as sobriety or participating in various programming. And in the narrative, what they basically said was, well, there's no conditions, because if we reduce the conditions, then all these people who aren't eligible to go into shelters will come off the street and accept this housing. That was essentially the bargain, and it didn't really pan out. They were able to show, the studies were able to show that essentially if you give people very low condition housing with these services, that people stayed there. They stayed there for a while.
Yeah.
What's happening right now is that the level of depravity on the streets in terms of addiction and psychosis has grown. And so this offer of housing and services has become a lot of the folks who are homeless on the streets, the chronically homeless, are no longer interested in it.
I see.
And so they'll use housing for a short period of time, but a lot of times they'll cycle back out of the housing.
So I guess why would they cycle back to the street? Is it because it's closer to drugs and other things?
Yeah, because what's happening is that it's no longer a rational proposition in the person's mind. Because of the potency of the new synthetic methamphetamine, the new synthetic fentanyl, and according to a lot of folks who are working on the streets, this is true in Los Angeles, they say everybody who's on the streets is on meth, and all the meth has fentanyl in it. So you have a level of depravity with respect to mental cognition, with respect to health, that can't understand the importance of housing stability, escaping the challenges of the street over the long term. There's and what I'm hearing is that a lot of times now you have folks that will use shelter not as a place to kind of assess their life and move forward, but they're using shelter because, oh, we're expecting rain this week. Very practical solutions. They did a sweep and I lost all my stuff. Well, I'm going to go to the shelter for a little while and then I'll be able to gather stuff and get my ID cards and all that kind of stuff. Once I get that, I'm back out.
I see.
Because that's where a lot of chronic folks, people experiencing homelessness, feel more comfortable. They feel that they have community there. And you hear it all the time. You read it in the news accounts. They say, well, I'll check out the shelter, but if there's rules that make me feel uncomfortable, then I'm out. And this is a very important point, because we've created this enabling culture that says everything is voluntary. So take what best suits you at the time.
Right.
There's no overarching incentive. There's no overarching culture that says you can't live on the streets.
So what can we do, right? I mean, you mentioned if you offer people permanent supportive housing, then first of all, there's a shortage of that. But even if you have unlimited supply of permanent supportive housing, you offer them to some of the unsheltered folks on the street, and then they may refuse it, or they may refuse to go to shelters, or they may refuse treatment. So what can we do to help them?
Well, the challenge that's happening, particularly in places like Los Angeles and California, is, well, the realization is happening where people are actually, the public is saying, we'll never get a handle on this problem unless we start compelling people to accept housing and shelter. And that's where it's, in fact, there was a news article last week from Portland that where one of the mayor's top deputies was basically saying things have gotten so bad, we just need to create congregate shelter sites that are staffed by the state National Guard to compel people to stay in the shelter grounds and to stay off the streets. So there's what's starting to happen is that the notion of compelling people is beginning to gain greater and greater voice. And when you look at some of the policies, for example, in California, things like the Lanterman-Petra Short Act that puts a very high threshold in order to compel folks with mental illness and psychosis to be held against their will. So now you've got state lawmakers saying, yeah, the thresholds of Lanterman-Petra Short are too high. We're unable to actually compel people to get off the street who need it the most, the ones that are gravely disabled. You've got folks who are beginning to talk about the fact that, we've got drug policies and the normalization of drug addiction that is not benefiting communities, because it's resulting in, crime and smash and grabs. And, in San Francisco, you're having a tremendous number of vehicle thefts, breaking and entering, things like that. And so people are beginning to backlash against that in terms of demanding places for people to go where they'll receive treatment so that they can escape this vicious cycle. So what's happening is the pendulum is starting to swing. Whether or not people respond to that and elected representatives respond to that is a different question.
Thank you for that. So we often hear people say there's a shortage of shelters in LA and San Francisco. There are not enough shelter beds. And is it fair to say that, you know, the funding for permanent supportive housing, which is very, very expensive, the funding for permanent supportive housing crowds out funding for shelters and transitional housing?
I think it is. I think that, so first of all, shelters are funded through a separate federal program called the Emergency Solutions Grant Program. And that is funding that isn't directed to continuums of care. It's directed to counties and states for them to assist in creating shelters. But the prioritization of funding for permanent supportive housing has resulted in a reduction of transitional housing and a reduction in programs. And so what you're seeing is you saw a lot of transitional housing programs convert to permanent supportive housing programs because the programs didn't want to lose the funding. So what happened was you saw a decrease in transitional housing beds. At the same time, you saw no new transitional housing beds come on because the prioritization was all on permanent supportive housing. So you're absolutely right. I think what happened was you would so one of the interesting things is that people would say, well, the prioritization of permanent supportive housing over transitional housing has resulted in higher returns to homelessness. And so the question is, they criticized transitional housing because they said they cherry picked. They only took the people who were willing to change their lives in some way. And right now, with permanent supportive housing being low barrier, so that you essentially don't cherry pick, you're having this high return to recidivism. So there is an actual argument to say that, well, nothing has really changed, but I actually think that the volume has increased. You have more people that are addicted to powerful drugs. You have more people, you have fewer places for people with serious mental illness to go. And all of this is combined in addition to the policy being in place, prioritizing low barrier versus high barrier housing first versus traditional kind of transitional housing programs. All of this have combined to show an increase on the streets. That's
really interesting. So we know transitional housing is part of the old staircase linear model, and rapid rehousing is sort of like part of the new housing first model. But if you look at them in terms of length, they're both short term, several months to a couple of years. So what is the fundamental difference between these two models?
Well, the fundamental difference is the requirement of participation in programming. The fundamental difference with respect to HUD is that transitional housing is oftentimes, and I'm hearing that it's becoming rarer and rarer to find transitional housing that use programmatic contracts instead of leases in order to secure housing. So one of the things that we know is true is that transitional housing started with programs that owned their own housing. So because they owned their own housing, they would invite people in and they would say, look, we will provide housing, we will provide food, we will provide programming. Your job is to participate in that programming. So come into our wholly owned housing and we'll work together to improve lives. As housing became scarcer and scarcer, now the means to get people into housing was more and more difficult because you didn't have programs that owned lots of open housing. So what the government attempted to do is to say, well, we're going to need to work with landlords. And if we're going to work with landlords to acquire more housing for this population, the only way we'll be able to do it is through a lease, because they had to lease the property from landlords, and then there would be a requirement that would lease it again to the tenants. So in terms of technicalities, the biggest distinction between permanent supportive housing and transitional housing is the lease, which if you can get people in on a lease, now what's happening is the Fair Housing Act governs evictions, which is another objective of, I believe, of the Housing First advocates. Get more people covered under the civil rights entitlement of the Fair Housing Act so that fewer people can be evicted for things other than failure to pay rent, destruction of property, or criminal activity. So there's, and in a transitional housing program, because you're the means by which you acquire the housing is a programmatic contract, it's easier to evict people who are in violation of the contract. So remember, the goal in homeless assistance programs is not necessarily to improve people's lives, whether they were addicted, whether they were mentally ill, whether they had low employment skills, couldn't get employed, things like that. The goal isn't necessarily to improve those lives and move them into, self-sufficiency or increased health or things like that. The goal is to increase housing stability. We need to get more people successfully housed. By transitioning people from transitional housing into permanent supportive housing, by exchanging the programmatic contract with a lease, you get more people under the Fair Housing Act, which then employs the courts to provide civil rights protections for people so that they won't be evicted.
That's
it's convoluted, really, but that's part of the rationale.
Yeah, you mentioned like under the Fair Housing Act, it's harder to evict people unless they maybe they are involved in criminal activities. But people are doing drugs. We know that they're doing drugs in their permanent supportive housing site, and then they're probably involved in some other criminal activities. So how come that's not? They're still not evicted?
Well, there's an incentive to keep people housed, even though they're involved in some of these lower level crimes.
I see.
So by creating vacancies, you're reducing funding to those programs. So there's a huge incentive that once someone is housed, you really want to keep them housed.
Right.
So a lot of these lower level things. So, and this is one of the challenges. One of the challenges is this conflict of objectives. Is the objective to increase housing stability versus the objective to improve people's lives? And because when you're looking at things from just a housing stability lens, there's no problem putting a recovering addict right next door to somebody who's an active user. There's no problem with that because you're looking at it from a housing stability lens. But if you look at it from a recovery lens, there's a huge problem with putting somebody in recovery right next door to somebody who's an active user, because you know that that's a recipe for a disaster, because instead of the person in recovery influencing the addict is going to, the person who's actively using is going to negatively impact the person in recovery. Then you're going to have two people who are in active use instead of healthier alternatives. So so that's, to me, that's significant, is when you look at what the objectives are from a economic housing stability, let's increase the number of affordable housing units, versus do we want to improve people's lives by helping them become sober, addressing their behavioral challenges, addressing their mental illness? How do we tie those treatments, which are clinical treatments, to housing instead of minimizing and discarding those treatments in exchange for kind of services that take a back seat to housing stability?
I see. Yeah, I totally agree. So in terms of providing services at the permanent supportive housing site. And a lot of those services are voluntary. So
They're
you're
all
not even,
voluntary. They're required to be voluntary.
right. So that, I mean, that means it's like all things go, you know, you basically give people total freedom.
Well, here's the problem. There's a number of problems. First of all, and this is part of the public relations campaign for the Housing First approach. They'll say things like all units are required to provide services. The requirement is not on the participant, the requirement is on the provider. The provider is required to provide services to the participant, but there's no skin in the game for the participants. They have every opportunity to reject every service that is offered to them. Second, understanding this arrangement, if you're a provider, what kind of services would you provide? You would provide low-cost services that don't impact your bottom line, your operational costs, if they're rejected. So the services are things like what I call drive-by case management, or transportation services, or help getting identification cards. Very, very kind of low impact services. The third problem I have with this provision, which is part of the homelessness assistance program, is that there is a huge assumption that services and housing can effectively act as a substitute for clinical treatment and clinical interventions. So imagine, you know, if your objective is to say, look, we have somebody who is seriously drug addicted, we have somebody who has a medical condition that needs to be treated, there shouldn't be a voluntary component to that.
Right.
And there should be some outcome-based measurements to say how many days of sobriety have there been created? How many days of mental health stability has this intervention produced? Why are we interested in those metrics? We're interested in those metrics because our objective is not housing stability, it's the stability and health of the person. I think one of the things that gets conflated in all this is the concept that, well, if you're not interested in housing stability, you're rejecting the benefits that housing has on people who were previously unhoused. It's like this false dichotomy between housing and treatment. And I don't see where that comes from. I know of programs that provide both housing and treatment that meet clinical objectives so that the people that are receiving the housing and the treatment are benefiting significantly. You have less recidivism, you have less returns to homelessness, you have much better health outcomes. So, and here's the thing. I don't have necessarily a problem with people being innovative and people saying, look, we're going to try this low barrier housing first approach. Great, go ahead and use it. But what's happening now is that it's a one size fits all top-down model that prohibits communities from being innovative and trying different models, including creating housing that is tied to treatment and clinical interventions. And that's the problem. We only have one note to play, and the one note is not serving so many people, and that's why they're ending up staying on the streets.
Thank you for sharing that. That's great. So I want to switch gear and just ask you about the inadequate supply of psychiatric beds and then facilities. And so we know that in 2004, California passed Mental Health Services Act, which levies 1% income tax on millionaires, basically. It was designed to transform California's behavioral health system to better serve people with serious mental health issues. So we have this new tax revenue, and it's almost been 20 years since the passing of the act. So how come we still see the number of psychiatric beds, psychiatric facilities dropping over time?
Yeah, and the short answer is because the tax and the collection of the revenues wasn't tied to any objectives of creating new facilities. It was simply tied to funding mental health services. And there's two big problems. So first of all, this tax revenue isn't making a dent in new psychiatric beds because the revenue is not going towards the creation of new facilities and residences. First, because the state has prioritized community-based mental health as a way to reduce costs instead of institutionally based mental health. And so what happens is community-based mental health is more focused on things like mental illness prevention, which, by the way, you can't prevent serious mental illness. There's no prevention for serious mental illness. It's going to, for helping people in the community where maybe there's generalized anxiety disorder or depression or needs for support. I'm not minimizing any of those kinds of things. What I'm suggesting is that community-based mental health fails to contemplate the complex needs of the seriously mentally ill that make up so many of those who are homeless. So the first reason that these revenues are not directed at psych beds and the needs of people who have serious mental illness and who are unhoused is because it's focused on community-based mental health, which is a lower cost alternative, but it doesn't get to the people who need the most help. The second reason that these revenues are not making a dent is because California has a public policy priority of pushing responsibility down to the county levels. Through realignment, there were two different what's called realignments in California's mental health policy. Basically, realignment meant pushing additional responsibilities down to the state or down to the counties in exchange for opportunities for additional state revenues. Anyway, these counties took these Mental Health Service Act dollars and they invested in community-based mental health, which I already said, and they also used them as a reimbursement for federal reimbursements for Medicaid and Medicare that are absent. So this brings up the issue of the federal regulation of the Institutes for Mental Diseases, the IMD exclusion. So there is a almost 60-year-old federal regulation that acts as a cap on the creation of psychiatric beds in facilities, and it also is a cap on how long people can be treated for things like serious mental illness. The IMD exclusion disincentivizes states to invest in facilities and in treatment for the seriously mentally ill. Therefore, this federal policy, the IMD exclusion, exacerbates the number of people with serious mental illness who are homeless. So what's happening is you've got a federal regulatory policy that acts as a cap on reimbursements to states of mental illness and addiction treatment for mental illness and addiction treatment. It acts as a cap. The consequences of that cap is that there are not enough places to go and not enough commitment to quality and long-term care to help stabilize these people and ensure that they become more healthy. Instead, The consequences, because we don't have enough places to go, because there's not quality care to the few places that do exist, you have people on the streets that are decompensating and are dying because of federal regulations and priorities at the state level that take the incentive away from the most vulnerable and the most serious to treat.
That's really sad to hear. I feel like a lot of times, when you're young, you feel the government is doing everything to help the most vulnerable. And as you get older, then you start to learn some policies were poorly designed and difficult to get rid of. And sometimes they have the best intention, but doing the worst things.
The bottom line with respect to homelessness policy, policies on mental illness treatment, policies on addiction treatment, it's the same understanding that bad policy creates bad outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So if you look at the policies and you look at the outcomes, there's a connection. The reason that we have more people who are seriously mentally ill and chronically addicted, who are unhoused and untreated on the streets of California, in my view, is because we have bad policy that incentivizes that kind of result.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. My last question for you, you live in San Diego, right? So you're more familiar than me about Proposition HHH.
Right.
Basically.
I'm also the executive director of the LA Alliance for Human Rights, which was the organization in Los Angeles that brought lawsuit against the city and the county for its failure to respond to the unsheltered and untreated in Los Angeles.
Oh, so you're very familiar with, LA. So we know that Proposition HHH received public support when it was passed, right? People voted for it, but now everybody knows it's much more expensive than it had anticipated at first. It's costing about 500,000 units. Sorry, it costing $500,000 for one unit. Yeah. So now, we voters now have new information, and then they do the math. This proposition is $1.2 billion, and one unit costs $500,000. So that's going to give us 2,400 units in total. Mm-hmm. That's compared to, in LA, we have 63,000 homeless individuals. That's a drop in the bucket. So what are the general sentiments among LA voters?
So there was a brand new study that was just released. It was reported in the LA Times last week about a focus group of LA voters on homelessness. And the upshot of that study was that voters are angry. Voters are really angry that they committed to these, $1.3 billion in bond funding for the creation of, ostensibly 10,000, units of permanent supportive housing. And they're not going to realize that. The voters in Los Angeles are realizing that the politicians and the bureaucrats are part of the problem, not part of the solution. So that's the one upshot. This election that's coming up this year is going to be a referendum on homelessness. All the polling indicates that the number one issue in Los Angeles is homelessness. It's tied to crime. It's tied to how services are provided. It's tied to mental illness and addiction. And it's tied to the growth of encampments and the unwillingness of the city and the county to eradicate encampments. So number one issue, but again, this is why the LA Alliance sued the city and the county to force them to balance their approach from permanent supportive housing to creating shelters, to require that the county do more to treat and to provide services to the folks who are off the streets getting into shelters. And then lastly, to demand the regulation of public spaces. Mm-hmm. So it's the thing that's amazing is that you know, we've seen various efforts to, for example, clean up Echo Park. We've seen efforts to clean the Santa Ana River Jetty in Orange County. We've seen efforts to clean out from under the 101 freeway in the West Valley of homeless encampments underneath the freeway. They've been successful. Public space has been reclaimed. People have gotten housed and are getting some kind of services. And these spaces are not being reclaimed by homeless encampments. It can be done. And the voters are seeing this, and they are going to take it out on the politicians, because the politicians have said one thing, and then they've kind of shrugged their shoulders and said, gosh, you know, give us more money so that we can produce the same results, which are not very good. Mm-hmm. I think what's going to happen is you're going to see increased demand to eliminate these large homeless encampments. You're going to see increased demand to reduce crime, reduce drug use, you know, open drug use, you know, address the public psychosis that's happening on the streets in Los Angeles. And in San Francisco, very similar, you know, a smaller number of people, but actually a greater intensity in the kind of depravity and lawlessness and morbidity and mortality. So people are starting to wake up. They're starting to see that they were essentially sold a bill of goods. And let's be very, very clear what the bill of goods was. The promise was, we know how to solve homelessness. You do it by providing housing and services. They provided housing and services, and this is not a causal statement, but homelessness has actually increased. So the first rule when you find yourself in a hole is to stop digging. So that's what needs to happen in California. It needs to happen in Los Angeles. We need different approaches. We need approaches that are not just based on economic, desirable housing outcomes, but that are based on behavioral and mental health issues, which are driving people to live in places that they're not meant to live in, and to see 5 people a day in Los Angeles dying on the streets, 3 to 4 people a day in San Francisco dying on the streets. We need to do something different. We need to challenge the status quo. And in my view, the best way to do it is to start challenging the policymakers, because this is a failure of public policy. The thing that I'm absolutely am bewildered by is why the people who are responsible for the homeless assistance programs that are handed down from HUD, handed down from the state of California, why people are defending them. Why aren't they saying, look, you've given us terrible tools, we need new tools. These tools are not working for this population in this environment with these kinds of housing costs. They're not working. We need to do something different.
Right. Thank you for that. So in that case, I mean, I guess my last question would be to demand new tools from the federal level. What kind of reforms do you expect may happen in the future?
The tools that I'm advocating for are, we need to restructure the continuum of care. It needs to be less like a cartel and more like a true consortium. There needs to be more accountability and transparency in how these federal funds are going to programs. We need to significantly bolster performance measures so that everybody knows what they're shooting for, and that we can fund people based on their ability to do things like actually have people complete treatment programs, have people complete workforce training programs, and see incomes go up. We need to shift the performance measures from this elusive kind of gimmicky housing stability to actually measures that are improving people's lives. So additional flexibility at the local level. We need to get rid of this one size top down, one size fits all approach and allow communities to innovate. If you want to go permanent supportive housing, great, go permanent supportive housing. If you want to go low barrier, great, go low barrier. If you want to try different hybrid models with low barrier and high barrier and transitional housing, why don't you let the actual program performance dictate what gets additional funding and support instead of this ideological tied to the mast attitude that housing first works all the time and we just have to keep feeding the beast, giving it more and more and more money. We've already, it's been 20 years. It's been 20 some odd years and we're seeing the challenges. The other thing that needs to happen is we need to break down these silos between behavioral health and treatment and housing. We need to tie housing to this population that is unhoused and untreated. We need to tie housing to actual clinical interventions and treatment that's required. And then the last thing that needs to happen is we need to hold people accountable. If you've been given billions of dollars and homelessness is going up, something is wrong.
Instead of asking for more.
Exactly.
Yeah, not exactly. A billion.
Yeah. So those would be my prescriptions are really to focus more on the causes and to create program performance measures that impact those causes. Let's be clear though. We need more housing of all types, particularly in places in California. We need it both on the market level in terms of low income, moderate housing. I mean, that's the problem, the state of California, to create unfavorable economic conditions and significantly negative regulatory hurdles in order to just build any kind of market rate housing. So that's on the state of California. But at the federal government level, we also need to understand that there's been this terrible disincentivization of places for people to go where they can receive the treatment that they need. So we need to add more acute care, subacute care, board and cares. We need to create more adult residential facilities. And we need to understand that this spectrum is not just a housing spectrum for the provision of affordable housing. This is a spectrum that provides what some of my friends and I, we call housing that heals. It's not just housing that's there to say, oh, great, we got another unit of affordable housing, but housing that says this housing has a particular purpose and this housing is tied into clinical services, intervention and treatment so that the people who reside there are actually going to improve and become and actually reduce their morbidity and mortality and hopefully increase their mental stability, become sober, increase their incomes, achieve those kinds of goals that improve self-sufficiency, whatever that might look like for those people.
Yeah, totally agree. Well, thank you so much, Paul. This is great. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me.
No, I'm super thrilled. This is what I'm passionate about.